There is a story many of us learn as children. It feels as solid and true as a fact. The story goes like this. Once, long ago, in a time we call the Middle Ages, everyone was ignorant. They were superstitious. They huddled in the dark, afraid of knowledge, and the most common, most basic belief they all shared was that the world was flat. They thought if you sailed too far, you'd fall off the edge. Then came a hero. His name was Christopher Columbus. He was a visionary, a man of science and courage. He knew the truth. The world was a sphere. He went before the powerful kings and stubborn churchmen of Spain. He begged for ships to prove it. The scholars and priests laughed at him. They quoted scripture. They called him a fool. They warned him his ships would tumble into the abyss. But Columbus was brave. He persevered. He got a ship, sailed west, and discovered America. He proved the world was round and single-handedly dragged Europe out of its dark, flat earth beliefs. It is a great story. It is simple, dramatic, and inspiring. It has a clear hero and clear villains. It paints a picture of progress, of one man's reason triumphing over collective ignorance. The only problem is that it is almost entirely false. The idea that people in the Middle Ages believed the earth was flat is a myth. It is a story invented much, much later in the 19th century. It tells us far more about the people who invented it than it does about people in the Middle Ages. The truth is, almost every educated person in medieval Europe knew the world was a sphere. It was not a secret. It was not a controversial idea. It was standard knowledge taught in the universities and discussed by theologians. So where did we get this story? Why does it stick so stubbornly in our minds? It persists because it is useful. It creates a simple narrative of the past. It draws a clean line between a supposedly dark and ignorant age of faith and a bright and brilliant age of reason. It makes us, the people of the modern world, feel smart and superior. We can look back and shake our heads at how foolish our ancestors were. This story of Columbus and the Flat Earthers was a piece of propaganda. It was created to make a point in a cultural battle that was happening hundreds of years after Columbus sailed. It was a tool used to argue that religion, specifically the Christian church, was an enemy of scientific progress. The image of priests telling Columbus he would fall off the edge was too powerful to resist, even if it never happened. The real history is, as it often is, more complex and more interesting. The medieval world was not a monolith of ignorance. It was a place of deep thought, of inquiry, of sophisticated argument. The people who lived then were not cartoons. They were intelligent human beings trying to understand the world with the tools they had. And one of the things they understood, a piece of knowledge they inherited from the ancient world, was that they lived on a giant ball. To understand their world, we first have to throw out the comfortable myth of the flat earth. We have to see the world as they saw it, not as later centuries wanted to imagine it. The real story begins not with Columbus, but thousands of years before he was even born. The knowledge of a round earth was not a modern discovery, it was an ancient one. The journey to this understanding began with the earliest civilizations, which did imagine a flat world. It is an intuitive belief. The ground we stand on looks and feels flat. The Babylonians pictured the world as a flat disk floating in an ocean. The ancient Egyptians had a similar view. For them, the sky was a canopy or a goddess stretched over a flat earth. These were not stupid ideas. They were based on everyday observation, but then the ancient Greeks started to look closer. They began a tradition of questioning, of looking for deeper explanations beyond what was immediately obvious. Sometime around the 6th century BC, Greek thinkers began to propose that the earth was a sphere. The idea is often credited to Pythagoras or his followers. We do not have his original writings, but later authors tell us he was the first. His reasoning might have been more philosophical than scientific. A sphere is the most perfect, most symmetrical shape. It made sense to him that the gods would create the world in this perfect form. By the time of Plato, a century or so later, the spherical earth was a common concept among educated Greeks. And Plato wrote about it as a settled fact, but it was his student, Aristotle, who provided the first solid observable proofs. Aristotle was not just a philosopher, he was a careful observer of nature. In the 4th century BC, he laid out several simple, powerful arguments for a round earth. First, he pointed to the stars. He noted that as a traveler goes south, new constellations appear above the southern horizon, while familiar northern constellations sink out of view. This would not happen on a flat Earth. On a flat surface, your location would not change, which stars are visible, only their angle in the sky. The changing view of the heavens was clear evidence of a curved surface. Second, he looked at ships sailing out to sea. When a ship leaves the harbor, it does not just get smaller and smaller until it vanishes. The hull disappears first, followed by the sails, and finally the top of Themis. This is exactly what you would expect to see as the ship moves over the curve of the Earth. It is an observation anyone near the sea could make for themselves. Third, and most famously, Aristotle pointed to the shadow of the Earth during a lunar eclipse. When the Earth passes between the sun and the moon, it casts its shadow on the lunar surface. Aristotle observed that this shadow is always circular. No matter how the Earth is oriented, its shadow is a circle. There is only one geometric shape that casts a circular shadow from any angle of sphere. A flat disk, for example, would cast a straight line or an oval shadow most of the time. These arguments were so compelling that the idea of a spherical Earth became the standard view in the Greek intellectual world. Now, it was not some fringe theory. It was accepted science. And then, about a century after Aristotle, another Greek thinker took the next logical step. His name was Eratosthenes, and he was the head librarian at the Great Library of Alexandria in Egypt. If the Earth was a sphere, he reasoned, then it must have a circumference, and he figured out a brilliant way to measure it. He had heard that, in a town called Syene in southern Egypt, there was a deep well. On a specific day, at noon on the summer solstice, the sun's rays shone straight down to the bottom of the well. This meant the sun was directly overhead. At the very same time in Alexandria, far to the north, he observed that a vertical stick, an obelisk, cast a shadow. The sun was not directly overhead there. He measured the angle of that shadow and found it was about 7.2 degrees, or about 1/50th of a full circle. Eratosthenes knew the distance between the two cities. Assuming the sun's rays were parallel, the difference in the shadow's angle was due to the curvature of the Earth. If the 7.2-degree difference corresponded to the distance between Alexandria and Syene, then the full 360 degrees of the circle would be 50 times that distance. His calculation, when converted to modern units, was remarkably close to the actual circumference of the Earth. He was only off by a few percent. This happened more than 200 years before the birth of Christ. This knowledge was compiled and refined by later scholars like the great astronomer Ptolemy in the 2nd century AD. Ptolemy's work, the Almagest, became the definitive text on astronomy for the next 1400 years. In it, the spherical nature of the Earth was the absolute starting point, the first assumption upon which all other calculations were based. When the Roman Empire declined, much of this ancient Greek knowledge was preserved, copied, and studied by scholars in the Islamic world and in the Byzantine Empire. And it was this legacy, the legacy of Aristotle, Eratosthenes, and Ptolemy, that was passed directly into the hands of medieval European thinkers. They were not starting from scratch. They were standing on the shoulders of giants. When we think of the Middle Ages, we often imagine a complete break from the ancient world. We picture the fall of Rome leading to 1,000 years of darkness and forgetting. But this is not accurate. The knowledge of the Greeks and Romans did not simply vanish. It was preserved and studied, especially in monasteries and, later, in the first universities. And that included the knowledge of the Earth's shape. The idea that the early Christian church suppressed this knowledge is central to the flat Earth myth. The charge is that religious dogma replaced scientific observation, but when we look at what the most influential Christian thinkers of the era actually wrote, we find the opposite. St. Augustine, one of the most important figures in all of Christian theology, wrote in the early 5th century. He was fully aware of the debate about the Earth's shape. He took the spherical model for granted. His concern was not with geography, but with theology. He was more interested in whether people could live on the other side of the world, what he called the antipodes. He doubted it, not because he thought they would fall off, but because he could not see how they could be descended from Adam and Eve or have been reached by the apostles. His objection was theological and about the unity of mankind, not physical. He never questioned the shape of the world itself. A few centuries later, in England, there was a monk named the Venerable Bede. He was one of the greatest scholars of the early Middle Ages. In his work, The Reckoning of Time, written around 723 AD, he explicitly described the world as a globe. He used the roundness of the Earth to explain why the length of daylight changes with the seasons and varies with latitude. He wrote, "The Earth is not merely circular like a shield, or round like a wheel, but is rather like a ball." He even repeated Aristotle's observations about the changing position of the stars as one travels north or south. This was not a book for a few elite scholars. It was a practical text used by priests and monks across Europe to calculate the date of Easter. The idea of a spherical Earth was embedded in the basic educational toolkit of the Church. As Europe moved into the High Middle Ages, this knowledge became even more widespread with the rise of universities. The standard introductory textbook for astronomy in every medieval university, from Paris to Bologna to Oxford, was a short book called De Sphera Mundi, or On the Sphere of the World. It was written by Johannes de Sacrobosco in the early 13th century. The very title tells you everything. The book's first chapter is dedicated to proving that the earth and the heavens are spherical. It used the same classical arguments from Aristotle and Ptolemy, the ship disappearing over the horizon, the changing view of the stars. Every student who received a basic university education in the Middle Ages learned that the world was a sphere. This was the established, undisputed consensus. The most famous thinkers of the era agreed. Thomas Aquinas, the towering intellectual figure of the 13th century, treated the Earth's roundness as a simple, demonstrable fact. In his masterwork, the Summa Theologia, he even used it as an example to explain the difference between two types of knowledge. He noted that the astronomer and the physicist both know the Earth is round, but the astronomer proves it with mathematics and observation of the heavens, while the physicist might prove it by observing how gravity pulls all things toward a center. The debate was not about if the Earth was round, but about the best way to prove it. But what about ordinary people? Did the peasant in the field believe the world was flat? This is harder to answer because they did not leave behind books and treatises. It is certainly possible that many uneducated people had a vague flat earth-like conception of their world based on their immediate experience. Their world was their village and the surrounding fields. The larger cosmic questions might not have concerned them. But the idea of a spherical earth was not locked away in an ivory tower. It appeared in popular culture. Dante Alighieri's epic poem, The Divine Comedy, written in the early 14th century, is a journey through a distinctly spherical world. When Dante travels down through the circles of hell, which is located inside the earth, he eventually passes the center of gravity and emerges on the other side, in the southern hemisphere, where he has to climb up to get to purgatory. The entire geography of his afterlife depends on the earth being a sphere. This was one of the most widely read works of the late Middle Ages. Art and symbolism also carried the message. A common symbol of royal or divine power was the globus cruciger, an orb or globe topped with a cross. Kings and emperors, as well as Christ himself, were often depicted holding this object. It symbolized their dominion over the world, and that world was represented as a sphere. This image was present in cathedrals, in manuscripts, and on coins. It was a visual reminder, woven into the fabric of medieval culture, of a spherical earth. So when Christopher Columbus came along at the end of the 15th century, he was not fighting against a flat earth consensus. There was no such consensus to fight. The debate he had with the Spanish scholars was not about the shape of the earth. Everyone in that room agreed it was a sphere. The debate was about the size of the earth. Columbus, relying on faulty calculations and wishful thinking, argued that the earth was much smaller than it actually was. He believed Japan was only a few thousand miles west of Spain. His critics, using the ancient Greek calculations that were far more accurate, argued that the Earth was much larger and that the ocean was far too wide to cross. In this debate, the scholars were right and Columbus was wrong. He was saved from failure only by the unexpected existence of two entire continents in his way. If educated people in the Middle Ages knew the world was round, and if the debate Columbus had was about size, not shape, then where did the flat Earth myth come from? How did a story with no basis in historical fact become so universally believed? The answer lies not in the 15th century, but in the 19th. The myth was a modern invention. The story began to take shape in the early 1800s. One of the first and most influential sources was a book published in 1828 by the American author Washington Irving. He is best known for stories like The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle. But he also wrote a multi-volume biography of Christopher Columbus titled A History of the Life and Voyages of Christopher Columbus. It was hugely popular and became the standard account of Columbus's life for generations. Irving was a writer of historical fiction, not a rigorous historian. He wanted to tell a compelling story to create a romantic hero for the young American nation. To do this, he embellished the facts. He invented dramatic scenes to highlight his hero's genius and courage. The most famous of these inventions was a scene where Columbus confronts a council of ignorant churchmen and scholars at Salamanca. Irving painted a vivid picture of Columbus laying out his brilliant, modern ideas, only to be shot down by narrow-minded theologians quoting the Bible and insisting the world was flat. In Irving's telling, these men warned Columbus that he would sail off the edge of the world. Well, it was pure fiction. No such scene ever took place. The real debate at Salamanca was about the width of the ocean, a legitimate scientific disagreement. But Irving's version was more exciting. It created a powerful conflict lone genius versus the ignorant establishment. The book was a bestseller, and this fictional scene was so memorable that people accepted it as history. The seed of the myth was planted. Throughout the 19th century, this seed was watered and cultivated by other writers and thinkers who had a specific agenda. This was an era of intense conflict over the role of religion in society, particularly in education and science. Some prominent intellectuals wanted to reduce the influence of the church and promote a more secular scientific worldview. To make their case, they constructed a narrative that they called the conflict thesis. The conflict thesis argued that history was a long war between two opposing forces, science and religion. In this war, science represented progress, reason, and enlightenment, while religion represented superstition, dogmatism, and the suppression of knowledge. The story of Columbus and the Flat Earthers was the perfect illustration of this thesis. It became Exhibit A in the case against religion. Two American writers were particularly responsible for popularizing this idea. The first was John William Draper, a scientist who wrote History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science in 1874. The second was Andrew Dickson White, a historian and the first president of Cornell University, who wrote A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology and Christendom in 1896. Both books were immensely influential. They presented the flat earth myth as a settled historical fact, a prime example of how the church had held back human progress for 1,000 years. White's book was especially detailed, citing supposed medieval sources and presenting Washington Irving's fictional account as real history. He portrayed the entire medieval period as a time when the patristic view of a flat earth dominated, a view that was only overthrown by the brave navigators like Columbus. These were not bad men. They were passionate advocates for what they believed in. White, for instance, was trying to build a great secular university, and he faced opposition from religious critics. He wrote his book to argue that religion should not interfere with the scientific work of the university. But, in their zeal to make their point, they distorted history. They created a caricature of the Middle Ages to serve as a villain in their 19th century drama. They ignored the actual writings of medieval scholars like Bede and Aquinas. They cherry-picked a couple of obscure eccentric figures who did argue for a flat earth, like a 6th century monk named Cosmas Indicopleus, whose views were rejected as bizarre even in his own time, and presented them as the mainstream. Their version of history caught on. It was simple, it was dramatic, and it fit the progressive narrative of the 19th and 20th centuries. It made its way into textbooks, encyclopedias, and classrooms. Children were taught the story of Columbus proving the world was round. The image became ingrained in our collective consciousness. The myth was repeated so often by so many trusted sources that it became true in people's minds, a piece of common knowledge that nobody thought to question. It was a successful piece of propaganda, and its effects are still with us today. Why does any of this matter? It is just one old story. Does it really make a difference if we have the facts right about what some people believed 1,000 years ago? It does matter, for several reasons. The flat earth myth is not just a harmless mistake. It distorts our view of the past, and in doing so, it distorts our view of the present. First, the myth promotes a lazy and arrogant view of history. It encourages what has been called chronological snobbery. This is the unconscious assumption that our own time is the pinnacle of intelligence and wisdom, and that everyone who lived before us was more ignorant, more foolish, and less enlightened than we are. When we believe the flat earth story, we look back at an entire millennium of human beings and dismiss them as simpletons. We pat ourselves on the back for knowing something as basic as the shape of our planet. This prevents us from seeing people of the past as they really were complex, intelligent individuals living in a different context. The medieval world was not a waiting room for the Renaissance. It was a civilization with its own achievements, its own brilliant thinkers, and its own sophisticated ways of understanding the cosmos. When we reduce it to a caricature, we lose the ability to learn from it. We cut ourselves off from a huge part of the human story. Second, the myth obscures the real and fascinating history of scientific discovery. The real story of how we came to know our world is much more interesting than the myth. It is a long, continuous story of observation, calculation, and debate that started with the ancient Greeks, was carried on by Islamic and Christian scholars, and was refined during the Age of Exploration. It was not a sudden flash of insight by one man against the tide of ignorance. Science does not usually work that way. It is a slow, collaborative process of building on past knowledge. By focusing on the non-existent debate about the Earth's shape, we miss the real debate Columbus had. As we saw, that debate was about the Earth's size. The scholars who advised against his voyage were the better scientists. They had the more accurate data. Columbus was the reckless optimist whose math was wrong. The story is a wonderful lesson in how luck and unintended consequences shape history. Columbus did not prove the world was round. He accidentally bumped into a continent that the experts, with good reason, did not think was there. This true story is messier and more complex than the myth, but it is also much more human and instructive. Finally, the flat earth myth continues to fuel a false and damaging narrative about the relationship between science and faith. The conflict thesis that was promoted by Draper and White in the 19th century is still very much alive. The idea that science and religion are eternal enemies is a common belief, but it is a belief that is not supported by history. For most of Western history, faith was not the enemy of science. In many cases, it was its main sponsor. The Church founded the first universities. Monks preserved the scientific texts of the ancient world. The theologians like Thomas Aquinas insisted that reason and faith were compatible, that studying the natural world was a way of understanding God's creation. Of course, there have been moments of conflict, like the Galileo affair, but these were exceptions, not the rule. The idea of a perpetual war between the two is a modern invention, and the flat earth myth is its founding legend. Letting go of this myth matters because getting the past right is important. History is not just a collection of facts. It is the story we tell ourselves about who we are and how we got here. A false story leads to a false understanding of ourselves. The story of our medieval ancestors huddled in fear on a flat earth is a story that makes us feel superior. But the true story of a long and difficult search for knowledge passed down through generations is a story that should make us feel humble. It reminds us that we are part of a long chain of human inquiry and that the people who came before us were not so different from ourselves. They looked up at the same stars and tried to make sense of the same world, and in one very important respect, they figured it out a long, long time ago.